Aside from being a divorced mother of a boy, Helen is a literature instructor. Her flawless, white complexion contributes to her allure. Let's examine the tale of Helen's brief liaison with a married gentleman. Helen spent one night with a man in the hotel. While they weren't in a relationship, here is where it all started. From then on, Helen frequently dreams about the body of the man with whom she slept one night. Helen never imagined that she would hear from the man again and that they would meet. Helen was excited, so she searched for a lovely clothing and even put on makeup. Finally, the man standing in front of Helen is Alexander, a Russian. Alexander was very anxious about Helen. Alexander quickly hugged and kissed Helen. The incidents at the hotel were completely replayed. This time at Helen's house, Alexander just smiled as he departed. While Helen fell asleep, Paul came from school who knew nothing about Alexander's visit to his mother. One time, Paul accidentally saw Helen while looking at Alexander's picture on the internet. Here, Helen started to be interested in Alexander. Alexander came one after another, not only to meet with Helen, but the anticipated hot scene was always the main event in his visit. Helen teaches literature, and every time Alexander comes, Helen rushes home. And Helen and Alexander's hot meeting continued that little by little Helen hoped that Alexander would love her. Helen's room seemed to smoke every time Alexander was with her. Helen's heart is always awesome every time she's with Alexander. For this reason, Helen stated that despite Alexander's marriage, he is permitted to see her whenever he pleases. Alexander's reaction seems to be the opposite because they won't see each other for a long time. To escape boredom while waiting for Alexander's call, Helen pushed her son to roam throughout Florence, Italy. Instead of forgetting Alexander, Helen misses Alexander even more. 3 weeks later, Helen receives the long-awaited call from Alexander. Inside the car, Helen is happy to be with Alexander again. Alexander's hands wandered around Helen's body mischievously. Maybe Alexander was longing for Helen or Helen's body only. The two went straight to the hotel as expected. While Helen was getting dressed, Alexander scolded him because she was wearing so thin that he can see Helen's body. Helen didn't like it, and the two argued. Helen is with Alexander most of the time and rarely meets with female friends. Helen just called to update her friend about her affair on Alexander. His son Paul did not know this. Whenever Alexander comes, the tenderness of the two often comes first, then the conversation follows. And here Helen often inquires about Alexander's wife that Alexander doesn't want to talk about. So Alexander just kisses Helen to interrupt and then avoid the question. Helen is preparing for her meeting with Alexander. Helen's constant goal is to appear well in front of Alexander. That explains why the allure of Helen is so strong for Alexander. This frequently leads to even more heated encounters between the two. Then comes the conversation. Helen obviously asked Alexander whether she was better than Alexander's wife, which Alexander did not like hearing from Helen. This time Helen doesn't want to let Alexander leave, but Alexander doesn't stop and is a little disgusted as he leaves. Normally Helen asks her female friend for advice on the phone. This time, Helen urgently met with her female friend to talk Alexander and his dealings with Helen. As a friend, she told Helen that Alexander had no love for Helen. It was here that Helen began to distance herself from Alexander. Helen didn't let Alexander in when he came to visit, but in the end, Helen gave up, went out the door, and chased after Alexander. After this incident, Alexander never called or visited Helen again. Seems Helen, female friend, is right about Alexander. From then on, Helen feels so much that he neglected his work, his son Paul, and himself. He often locks himself in the room and gets drunk. It has come to the point where Helen needs to consult a psychiatrist. 8 months later, Helen has recovered from the depression she suffered from having an affair with Alexander. She was able to focus again on taking care of her son Paul. Until one night, Alexander unexpectedly calls, wants to visit Helen instead of getting angry. Helen found a way. He made Paul sleep at a friend's house. As Alexander has arrived, Helen looked at Alexander and gently hugged him. With Alexander's embrace, Helen's cold room seems caught fire again. Helen notices that there is something new about Alexander. He seems ready to care and love Helen. Alexander was drunk. Helen drove to take Alexander back to the hotel. She confides in Alexander that this will be their last meeting. Helen has made a top decision to break off the relationship, even if it hurts Helen. But she has woken up to the fact that she can't expect a married man to love her with all his heart. Helen made a right decision, for we know that one day Helen will meet a man worthy of Helen's pure love.